The surprisingly well-documented and frequently greatly misunderstood everyday lives of Roman prostitutes are our starting point for tonight. Everyone, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. You find yourself in a room that is just big enough to turn around without bumping into a wall when you wake up, or more precisely, when you regain consciousness. And if your home was a broom closet and your profession included body oil, then congratulations. You live in a cellar, the ancient Roman equivalent of a work-from-home arrangement. Many working women in Rome were provided with these chambers on a regular basis. They were small, windowless rooms that used as both living quarters and workspaces, and they were found in brothels, lupanars, or stacked above pubs, and bathhous. Imagine it as a studio apartment created by someone who despises privacy, light, and air. Your mattress is filled with straw, may have been inhabited by fleas, and has a subtle scent of disappointment, smoking, and wine. There is, if you're lucky, a tiny oil lamp. It hasn't been stolen. If you're lucky, your few belongings: a comb, some inexpensive makeup, and perhaps a bronze mirror if you're lucky are stuffed into the corner as if they're sick of being here. 2. There is no plumbing, no running water, just a bucket that you try not to worry about, taking a bath. Later, it will be a group activity at the closest public bathhouse, where awkward eye contact is free and the water is shared. However, since your room doubles as an office and business hours are when someone knocks, bursts in, or yells through the door, there is no time for lounging. Indeed, privacy is a contemporary idea. Doors are ornamental and walls are ideas here in Rome. Most days start with a brief tidying up of the space, including removing any dust from the previous day, wine stains, and any misplaced sandals that the guests from the previous evening may have left behind. The preparation follows rouge, face powder, and enough scent to be considered flammable. You don't want to smell nice. You're attempting to outsmell the person behind you in line. In front of the golden mirror, you practice your most seductive half-smile. It's because pretending helps, not because it works. Here in the cellar, every day starts the same way: crowded, hurried, and with just enough dignity to last until lunchtime. A customer once said that you were beautifully awake, and you're still feeling the emotional high from that. It's time to get ready for another day of pleasing clients and avoiding criticism after waking up in your glorified broom closet. First, though, hygiene, or what it was called in ancient Rome. Naturally, there isn't a private restroom. The wealthy are the only ones who can afford that luxury, and even they only had ambitious pots, depending on your mood and tolerance for uncomfortable nudity. The closest public fountain or bathhouse is your best bet as a working girl in a city that reveres marble sculptures yet tolerates exposed sewers. You use the common fountain for a fast rinse if you're rushed for time, which, let's face it, you usually are. Rinse your lips with wine if you're feeling very upscale. Splash some water on your face, and hope the fountain wasn't used to clean a chicken that morning. Perhaps you have some natron, a salty cleansing powder that exfoliates your skin and boosts your self-esteem, but there isn't any soap. You might decide to visit the public baths, the great Roman equalizer. If business is slow and you have some spare cash, philosophers, soldiers, businessmen, and that guy who shouts too loudly about his hemorrhoids, everyone is there. You take off your clothes, put your things in a place you trust far too easily, and then you wade into a pond filled of philosophical arguments and toenails. For around 5 minutes, you are the cleanest person on your neighborhood. You sweat in the steam chamber, scrape yourself with a strigil, a curved metal blade, and savor the moment. You dry off after taking a bath, reapply additional perfume, and try to recall whether deodorant has been invented yet. They haven't. Kohl around the eyes, a touch of rouge for the cheeks and lips, and a small amount of face powder with a chalk base complete the appearance. To conceal the weariness, not to draw attention to your beauty. Before noon, clients don't want to see the woman who has already dealt with a sailor and 3 senators. They are looking for someone who doesn't smell like old lentils. Mystery and intrigue. It's time to dress now that you've been cleaned, or at least sufficiently perfumed. Even though Roman society had many complex views on dress, there was one ensemble that was very unambiguous: the toga worn by women. Toga. Indeed, we typically associate that flowing white robe with frat parties, senators, and emperors. Here's the twist, though. Wearing a toga was not a political statement for a lady in Rome. She was making a work-related one. It served as a visual advertisement for the statement, "I am open to negotiation, and I am not a respectable matron." The stola, a long, layered garment that said, "My husband controls my dowry and I go to bed at 9, was worn by proper Roman ladies. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were legally prohibited from wearing the stola and had to wear a toga, which was typically short, flamboyant, and colorful. Less Greek goddess, more apparent from the other side of the forum. Typically, the ensemble was paired with inexpensive jewelry, glass or bronze beads, and sometimes some statement earrings. Elegance was not the aim. Visibility was the issue. Subtlety is an unaffordable luxury when you're competing with 20 other women inside a 100-meter radius. Shoes, simple sandals, probably, depending on the area and financial constraints. You might even go barefoot. There was no emphasis on comfort. You will be standing, walking, and perhaps running away from a nasty client or an overzealous moralist for the most of the day. Hair was another story. Roman prostitutes frequently painted and curled their hair, and occasionally they wore wigs, particularly blonde ones that were brought over from Gaul. In Rome, blonde hair had a certain exotic appeal, similar to imported luxury soap, but more vibrant. Not to be overlooked are the last details. Cosmetics. Use heavy kohl eyeliner to draw attention to your eyes and pale face powder to contrast with red cheeks and lips. At the very least, appear less sleep-deprived. When you were all clothed, you were plain. That was the main idea. Your attire served as your business card in a city with a population of 1 million. Congratulations if it gave you a daring, scandalous, and financially accessible appearance. You were prepared for yet another beautiful day of being actively supported by society and subjected to its judgment. You're painted, clothed, scented, and, ideally, not too inebriated. The exciting part is about to begin. In a city where everyone wants sex yet acts surprised to learn that it's for sale, commerce is booming. Marketing wasn't subtle in ancient Rome. There were no websites, no brochures, and most definitely no branding experts. You had to be noticed, loud, or immortalized in graffiti if you wanted customers, ideally all 3. First, let's talk about location strategy. If you were employed by a brothel or lupanar, your workplace was already designed to be visible. Brothels were frequently found next to baths, marketplaces, or bars. In other words, any place where people may already be bored, sweaty, or easily influenced. Consider foot traffic optimization from the past. Wearing your best look at me attire, you would stand in the doorway and call out to people passing by, with a mix of time-sensitive offers, flattery, and negotiating, in a hurry, to denarii. This may sound desperate, but it's true. The next girl over simply lowered her rate to 1 when the rent was due. It was all about roaming visibility. If you were a freelancer, you might lurk about bars, ready to flirt with a drunken legionary who still had some money and dubious judgment. Or you might hover around temples, for nothing shouts divine inspiration like temptation. But the strangest, and strangely successful, kind of Roman advertisement. Graffiti on walls. Yes, the creativity of ancient street marketing has been immortalized. By Pompeii, handwritten reviews such as Maritimus gave me the best time of my life were plastered on the brothel walls. Or Felicia, very quick service, to Denarii. These were old Yelp, not merely vandalism, unrestricted, unfiltered, and extremely public. Some ladies even paid a person to sign their name and specialization in a prominent place, generally on columns or close to pub entrances. Others delegated the writing to their clients, who wrote everything from ecstatic laudatory verse to perplexed haiku about being stolen. One thing became evident from all of this. Marketing was just as important to a prostitute's survival as skill. Someone else was receiving the business if they didn't know your name, your prices, and your approximate level of enthusiasm. Because, just like today, skill wasn't always the key to success in ancient Rome. It was simply better PR at times. You have thus promoted yourself. You've got the eyeliner, the clothes, and enough self-assurance to pass for cheerful. Pricing is the topic of discussion now. When ancient Rome feigns a free market while secretly evaluating you nevertheless. Let's be clear, no union existed. Supply and demand, as well as whatever you could get away with before someone bartered you down with a loaf of stale bread, determine the rates. Prices may be as low as 1 or 2 asses, a little bronze coin that wouldn't even buy you a glass of wine, for street-level laborers or people in less expensive lupanars. Yes, exactly. Some customers were paying less than what a good lunch would cost. If that sounds gloomy, keep in mind that some ladies took promises, food, or even sandals in exchange. Yes, IOS were still in use in a metropolis with the courtesy of an empire. Conversely, upscale sex workers, sometimes known as meritresses, function more like luxury brands. If these ladies were skilled outside of the bedroom, they may charge in denarii, silver coins, and occasionally more than one per client. Poetry, music, conversation, simple literacy, anything that gave a client the impression that they were hiring not just a business, but also a person with taste. There were also some prostitutes who had marketing specializations rather than architectural ones. Perhaps your area of expertise was working with sailors, doing sexual dances, or reciting poetry while acting. Don't laugh. Someone was undoubtedly inspired by Ovid. You got less interchangeable as your brand became more distinctive. There may or may not be a discount for returning customers. If you worked for a brothel or pimp, a large portion of your profits vanished before you saw a single coin, and it all hinged on whether they paid on time or smelt like sour cabbage. Some women were slaves, meaning they received only food, shelter, and a hazy assurance that they might eventually purchase their freedom if they were lucky enough to win the Roman lottery. They were not paid at all. Greetings from the Roman brothel known as the lupanar. Although it lacks luxury, the fact that it has walls immediately elevates it beyond working behind a tavern. It's a place of business. Technically. In reality, it's a maze of poor choices and sweaty stone. The word lupa, which means she-wolf, is the root of the word lupanar. It was termed for prostitute in Roman culture. Yes, your animal comparison was also your work title. At least it's consistent, even if it's not really empowering. The majority of lupanars were 2-story structures sandwiched between bars and bathhouses, ideal for drawing foot traffic from bored sailors and senators who were half drunk. Inside, you'll find a narrow hallway with small rooms, each with a thin mattress, a stone bed, and enough area to make you reevaluate your life decisions. For an open floor layout, use drapes instead of doors. Confidentiality. It was a possession of wealthy matrons. You may hear someone snoring through your shift wall and see wet linen. Of course, you're not alone. One charming parasite, called the lino, pimp, or leaner, madam, was among the many working ladies of a proper lupan air. It was their responsibility to deduct money from your paycheck, make unfulfilled repair promises, and sporadically shout things like work faster and he's important. Clients were balding senators, sweating lawmakers, and anxious youngsters who said this was merely a philosophical visit. Some went in and out more quickly than a denarius dropped. To be honest, it was worse when others attempted to discuss their poems. You would shout out to passing pedestrians while sitting close to the entrance during downtime, putting on your best "I'm flirty, but dead inside" face. The majority of marketing was volume-based. I'll pretend to listen to the special too. Coins for today. Indeed, there was graffiti all over the walls. Lovefully carved onto the plaster are ancient Yelp reviews. Felix came here twice. Perhaps ties are entertaining. Every now and then, someone would get creative and draw pictures. Rarely were proportions correct, but there was never a shortage of confidence. Although it wasn't glamorous, working in a Lupiner was reliable. If you squint, you'd always have a front row ticket to humanity's most bizarre parade, along with a bed and a roof over your head. Not all Roman sex workers were employed by Lupiners. Some were consigned to the similarly glamorous world of bars, or preferred it. The tavern was more like working in an outside startup, with more vomit and fewer stock options. If the brothel was a hectic office cubicle, Rome's best drunkards, merchants, off-duty soldiers, and men named Gaius with gambling debts congregated at taverns, known as colpini or popini, to drink, yell, and act as though they understood Virgil. The motto for the prostitutes who worked here was straightforward: avoid the gropes, sell the charm, and serve the wine, pouring watered-down wine into filthy glasses for folks who wouldn't notice the difference anyway was a common shift. You flirted with your other hand just enough to maintain the flow of denarii, but not enough to start a fight, unless you found that fight amusing. Otherwise, continue. Since pubs were officially food establishments rather than brothels, you had the pleasant background of fish sauce, boiled cabbage, and body odor. It meant you could upsell a customer, but it was also an aroma that stuck to your spirit and your tunic. I'll pretend you don't smell like garum for $2 more. The tavern was a table service brothel with some ladies working upstairs or in the rear rooms. Others maintained a more relaxed atmosphere by providing lap-sitting, companionship, and highly suggestive remarks such as "your toga looks clean." In Rome, this was well praised. Payment was frequently made right away. There was no credit. You have choices if a client attempted to postpone. The bouncer, typically a one-eyed, short-tempered retired gladiator, could be grabbed, yelled at, or threatened. The benefit: there was increased foot traffic and occasionally better tips at taverns. The drawback: you worked as a hostage negotiator, therapist, and waiter all at once, and nobody paid you for your emotional labor. Not to mention the never-ending soundtrack. Dice clacking, shouting, liars vying for women's attention, and the sporadic dispute over who came up with democracy. Tavern duty was erratic, draining, and reek of hopelessness. However, it covered the expenses, occasionally. If the patrons didn't initially vomit on your sandal. There was always the street for the enterprising soul who was overconfident and had no connection to brothels. In Rome, being a freelance prostitute entailed balancing the roles of independent contractor and "don't arrest me." Opportunities were abundant in the streets of Rome. Sewage as well. Outdoor prostitutes, known as prostabili, prowled the alleys, bathhouse doors, marketplaces, and sometimes the steps of temples, because giving a discount outside a Venus shrine is the epitome of divine intervention. Although dangerous, daylight hours were good for transportation. You had to deal with curious bystanders, inquisitive judges, and irate matrons who believed your presence was impairing their husband's self-control. As a spoiler, it wasn't. You stood out by wearing bright clothing, consider revealing jewelry, short tunics, and possibly a wig fashioned from imported German hair. From across the Circus Maximus, it was more obvious and less subtle. The objective was to get a client's attention before his spouse did. A precise ballet of flirting, timing, and avoiding being mistaken for someone's fugitive slave was required when approaching a possible consumer. before the neighborhood vigils and street guards deemed your entrepreneurship to be a public disturbance. You would grin, admire his sandals, and casually indicate your rate. A few customers were really perplexed and only needed directions to the baths, while others were kind and aggressively inexpensive. You soon discovered that you could distinguish between them mostly by the quantity of coins they jingled and the degree of eye contact. There was intense competition. You faced more than just other prostitutes. You faced retired gladiators with a side business, inebriated party girls, and free lovers. They were all attempting to create a denarius. Benefits and security were absent, just your intellect, your charm, and your ability to move quickly in sandals. Some depended on local tavern bouncers or carried tiny knives. Others merely prayed that the patrons tonight weren't philosophers who struggled with commitment. Nevertheless, the street environment had its benefits despite its mayhem. You didn't have to answer to a lino breathing down your neck. You established your own hours and pocketed your own income. Even though the job occasionally involved philosophical hecklers or inebriated goats, at least you were in charge of your own destiny in a city where bosses were rarely the good guys. Allow us to present your least favorite client, the Roman tax collector. If you thought being a prostitute in ancient Rome was difficult enough, indeed, the Roman Empire great builders, Mediterranean conquerors, and toga's champions also created a special tax on sex workers. This system, known as the vectigal ex capturis, made sure that even your most embarrassing interactions benefited Rome's public works projects. Congratulations! Another aqueduct has been made possible by your nightly services. Additionally, the tax was more than merely unauthorized pocket skimming. This was a state-approved system run by publicani, or professional collectors, who were, in some ways, both uninteresting and dangerous. They required cash payments, kept thorough records, and most likely assessed your perfume preferences while they scrawled on their wax tablets, the aediles, the Roman counterpart of a city inspector, who had a penchant for bureaucracy and moral superiority, required prostitutes to register in order to lawfully operate. You were included to an official registry of sex workers upon registration. Consider it similar to joining a trade union, but without the perks and with a logo in place of a card. Indeed, some sex workers, particularly those who were enslaved, had their owner's name or other marks like looper tattooed on them. Don't worry if you're wondering how that affected your clients. They didn't like the branding. It was done to make sure you couldn't subsequently act respectable, as well as the tax rate, location, class, and whether your clientele were depressed, senators, or cheap gladiators all affected it. However, it hurt every time. Depending on the area, you paid either by the act or by the week, and existential dread, uncomfortable silences, or emotional labor were not deducted. Although enforcement was sporadic, refusing to pay may result in penalties, incarceration, or employment bans, particularly if you were paying illegally or knew how to flirt with an aedile. Still, this tax made matters worse for a profession already beset by stigma. In essence, Rome was saying, "We don't like the way you live. Give us 10% as well." On the plus side, though, you could at least claim that your efforts were contributing to the construction of a new temple, most likely honoring a goddess who has yet to answer your prayers. Being a prostitute in ancient Rome meant that you were both legally permitted to exist and socially permitted to face constant criticism. Indeed, prostitution was taxed, regulated, and even registered under the law. However, that didn't stop every bored philosopher, senator, and priest from telling you how much they didn't like you often while zipping up their tunic. The moral police, a large unpaid network of senators, priests, matrons, and writers who felt it was their holy mission to humiliate you while secretly enjoying the spoils of your labor, are here. They are not an official squad with batons. The Roman Senate, a group of elderly aristocrats who supported the preservation of Roman virtue, which they usually characterized as anything we're not caught doing, was at the top of the hypocrisy food chain. Many of them kept discreet tabs at every brothel from the Forum to Sabura while openly denouncing moral deterioration. Then there were the aediles, the real public servants of Rome who upheld the laws of decency, cleanliness, and order. Their duties included inspecting brothels, regulating them, and occasionally fining women for being overtly public about their occupation, which was again mandated by law. Even if you tried, it wouldn't be subtle. Seneca and Juvenal were among the writers who had a great time. They made fun of prostitutes in poem, putting them in the same category as loud ladies, avaricious merchants, and, worst of all, bookish women. Nevertheless, these same authors described brothel life in vivid, dubious detail, as though they had done a great deal of research. Roman matrons, the esteemed spouses of the aristocracy, also joined the verdict. Naturally, they wouldn't talk to you, but they would pass your corner with eyes that might kill a fig tree. Since many of their husbands considered visiting bathhouses as part-time occupations, some even petitioned for regulations that would prohibit prostitutes from wearing jewelry or going into public baths. There were risks associated with becoming a Roman prostitute, including illness, accidents, and whatever the Brundisium sailor left behind. Welcome to the chapter on health and wellness, where the only advice is to hope you live. Let's start with venereal disease, which is the big one. Although germ theory was unknown in ancient Rome, they were aware that certain men left you with more than a poor poem and a currency purse. Roman writings describe symptoms that range from items coming off that shouldn't be there to constant itching, the suggestion from the doctor, typically a combination of herbal ointments, vinegar washes, and fervent prayers to Venus, another constant. Worrying was pregnancy. They were alternatives if you had the money and the courage, but there was no birth control pill. For this reason, prostitutes employed natural contraceptives like silphium, an extinct herb that was infamously over-harvested, while tampons soaked in herbal mixtures and animal intestines as rudimentary condoms. Efficiency, in the middle of maybe and miraculous, pregnancy made matters more difficult. Some women gave birth and reared their offspring, frequently in the brothel. Some abandoned babies to homeless shelters or, worse, the streets. It was illegal to kill infants, but ignoring it, it was like a civic obligation. Usually, wine, opium, or a smack from your leaner to stop complaining were the go-to remedies for everyday ailments, tired muscles, cuts, and stress-induced fury blackouts. If it didn't work, you could go to an Asclepius temple and sleep on the floor in the hopes of having a healing dream. Ancient wellness culture focused more on magical naps with side effects than spa weekends. Infections were frequent. Hygiene had high aspirations. Nobody was cleaning their hands before inserting their fingers where they shouldn't have been. And there were no gloves or antiseptics, not to mention the emotional toll. Anxiety, trauma, and depression, all aspects of the work. There were no therapists in Rome. You had wine, other prostitutes, and the odd stray cat who listened to you without passing judgment. Prostitutes weren't merely evading moral scrutiny in a city where everything from floods to flatulence was attributed to supernatural intervention. Additionally, they sought to maintain their good standing with the gods, or at the very least, by good health, good fortune, and a clientele that required little upkeep. The gods were always observing, judging, and sometimes cursing, and religion in ancient Rome was a full-time occupation. However, there were other gods in the divine pantheon who were, let's say, more understanding of your line of work. Venus, the goddess of beauty, love, and generally bad judgment, came first. In their quarters, numerous prostitutes erected little altars in her honor, in an attempt to draw wealth, charm, or at the very least, customers who didn't smell like boiling goat. Offerings of flowers, perfume, or money were made. The goddess of luck, Fortuna, then appeared. Fortuna was something of a huge deal, considering how erratic your daily income was from a promise to 3 rotting grapes and a gold bracelet. A customer with too many rings and suspiciously clean sandals might enter, and you might whisper a brief prayer or wear a charm that features her likeness. However, religion wasn't all glitz and glamour. Omens, magical countermeasures, and superstition were all part of the darker side of belief, because you should always blame the spirits. When in doubt, you would pay a professional witch to curse a rival prostitute's hairline, wrap red cords around your ankle for protection, or burn incense. To ward off the evil eye, refrain from laughing. Numerous depictions, or cursed tablets, resembling old Yelp retribution ratings, have been discovered around Roman brothel areas. May she rot her tongue. I hope her clientele goes dry. May she misstep and fall in the feces of donkeys. You may also offer prayers to Mercury, the god of trade and transactions, if you were a slave, because your life was one continuous receipt. Let's face it. Additionally, Libertas, the goddess of liberty, received a private altar and a somewhat more costly candle if you were fortunate enough to save money for freedom. This spiritual endeavor was not only customary, it was stylish survival. The gods were your human resources department when Rome handed you bad senators, illness, and judgment, always taking offerings, mostly meaningless, and sometimes beneficial. In the Roman prostitution industry, love was a complex concept. At worst it was a financial utility in a tunic, and at best it was a pleasurable fantasy. After 3 glasses of wine and half a monologue about their mother, clients claimed to fall in love all the time. Some were attempting to obtain a discount, some were intoxicated, and some were sincere. Clutching your hand like a tragic poet, they would exclaim, "But baby, I'm different." And although you were thinking about how much they still owed you, you would nod courteously, at least in appearance. Several working women felt the same way. There was emotional effort included. Pretend his toga doesn't smell like misery while you listen and smile. You may even create something tangible for a select few clients. Affection, attachment, or simply tiredness on both sides. However, romance was always a risky diversion, particularly when you kept in mind that you were legally classified as infamous in Rome, which meant that you could not legally marry a citizen, even if you so desired. Despite this, many continued to try. There are stories of prostitutes falling in love with their regulars, promising them freedom, marriage, and a home with a garden, only to leave them the instant a more attractive woman passed by. Some customers truly loved their favorite friend, and they showered them with presents, poems, and sometimes even the formal process of releasing a slave, known as manumission. There are such tales, but they were the exception rather than the rule. Real ties were more likely to form among fellow prostitutes. You shared the same lice, worked next to each other, and put up with the same taunts. Sisterhoods developed from some of these friendships. Others developed into discreet romantic relationships, shielded from Roman patriarchy, which held that women could only fall in love with men who possessed a collection of swords. Naturally, there were also falsehoods you told yourself, such as that you would quit one day, that your best client would actually whisk you away, and that, with a little more money, you would open a perfume shop in Ostia and never look back. Everyone in Rome had a fantasy, even if it wasn't true. Yours simply had lesser expectations and better lighting. Youth was the money and beauty the exchange rate in the Roman world of sex trade. What transpired? Then, when your joints began to pop more loudly than your earrings, the client stopped lingering, and the blush faded. Easy. You didn't vanish, but you did age. Some women were able to purchase their freedom if they were enslaved and start again after carefully saving money or, astonishingly, having a client with both money and follow-through. The luckiest opened bathhouses or pubs and let the next generation of desperate hopefuls stay in their quarters. Others became liney, madams, the brothel equivalent of senior management, with more yelling and less action. You didn't have to be young or attractive to be a slimmer. You had to be quick, threatening, and skilled at making threats about sandals and past due bills. You maintained the books, managed the timetables, and ensured that the drapes were not too gruesome. Customers were afraid of you. Employees feigned respect for you. When they saw you approaching, the eagles let out a sigh. Fortune-telling was popular among other retired prostitutes. Predicting disaster becomes instinctive once you've witnessed every error pass through the door and heard every confession. Some turned to become herbalists, wise ladies, or unofficial therapists, giving sarcastic and marginally inaccurate medical advice. But since Rome was not in the habit of providing pensions to women who had worn togas for 20 years, many just continued to work. The older prostitutes simply changed their marketing strategies, but they still had customers. More mature, discreet, less flushing, more tolerant of poetry. Both reputation and physical appearance were important. A woman who is renowned for her ability to talk, be kind, or blow people away. She might continue to be in demand for astrological readings long after her prime. The possibilities weren't good for anyone who didn't have any savings, customers, or good fortune. You worked in laundromats, cleaned temples, and begged until your hands withered like olives. Rome simply cared that you aged in silence, not how you aged. The truth is, however, that they did not etch into stone. For many, the accomplishment was simply surviving, and you were already a legend if you survived to old age with at least one functional sandal and your wit intact. People often imagine great speeches, marble statues, and emperors with dubious family histories when they think of ancient Rome, something they hardly ever imagine. The woman leaning in a brothel doorway, fiddling with her wig, and figuring out in her head how much money she needed to avoid starvation the following week. Roman sex workers did more than merely work in the background. History has kept them there, skillfully removing them from the noble narrative so that pupils can learn about aqueducts without having to ask awkward questions. But they were everywhere. In receipts, legal documents, satire, love letters, poems, graffiti, and curse tablets. Real receipts, indeed. Despite the fact that society viewed them as morally infectious wallpaper, they were an integral part of everyday Roman life. The assumption that these women were helpless victims or immoral seductresses is what history typically gets wrong. In actuality, a large number of them were astute, flexible, and, dare we say it, more adept at business than half of the Senate. In a city that applauded gladiators and stoned anyone wearing the wrong shoes, they were skilled at reading a customer, negotiating conditions, avoiding danger, and making a living. They also differed from one another. Some were free, while others were slaves. Some catered to those with money and foul breath, while others catered to the wealthy. Some people detested every second. Others carved out little nooks of habit and authority. Like everyone else in Rome, the majority lived somewhere in the middle, acting as though they were not exhausted. They seldom ever wrote their own stories. Rather, they were remembered by moralists clutching their pearls, by poets searching for metaphors, or by archaeologists piecing together the racist wall scribbles from Pompeii. This is what's noteworthy, though. You can still see them. Laws and loopholes, sarcastic graffiti, stone sculptures, and casual references in love poems. Though not from reality, these women were removed from respectability. They were productive. They chuckled, they conned, they shed tears, and they persevered. None of them had golden tombs or marble statues, a deteriorating wall with faint ink. Here was Meridema, and she was priceless. So keep that in mind the next time someone waxes poetic about Rome's splendor. Every toga-clad philosopher has a working girl behind them, sustaining the economy and the rumors. Injuries were a common occurrence in the Viking era due to the ongoing nature of combat. Severe burns from fire and frost, axe wounds, fractured bones, and deep cuts from swords. The Lecnia, the healer, was called upon to tend to the injured on the battlefield or in the hamlet. These people were well-respected members of the community who combined the spiritual traditions of Norse belief with the practical understanding of herbs. Among the most reliable herbs in a Viking healer's arsenal was Achillea millefolium, or yarrow. Throughout northern Europe, yarrow was commonly utilized because of its reputation for stopping bleeding. The leaves would be crushed and applied directly to wounds by Viking healers, either by themselves or combined to make a poultice. As a coagulant, yarrow helped to halt blood flow and stave off infection. Legends associated its potency with Odin himself, and it was thought to have sacred characteristics. Such cures were prepared in a systematic manner with cultural rituals as their foundation. The healer may apply crushed yarrow, bathe the wound with hot water infused with antibacterial herbs, and then securely tie the area with strips of animal skin or linen. Invoking the gods' protection or healing, chants or prayers were sometimes recited throughout the procedure. Healing was a spiritual as well as a bodily process. Yarrow was utilized internally as well as for wounds sustained on the battlefield. Its blooms and leaves can be used to make a tea that can aid with menstrual cramps, digestive issues, and fevers. The plant was incredibly adaptable and might be found growing in fields, by rivers, or in tiny garden plots tended by domestic women across the Viking homelands. Viking healers had a profound awareness of their surroundings. They were able to gather plants appropriately, preserve them for use throughout the long, dark winters, and know which plants grew in different seasons. From mother to daughter, or from elder to apprentice, knowledge was typically transmitted over generations. These customs combined the rich cosmology of Norse mythology with aspects of Germanic medicinal lore. The ability of the healer and the potency of plants like yarrow were crucial for life and for preserving strength in a warrior-driven society. In a world without hospitals or contemporary antibiotics, the Viking healers' fight against infection necessitated deeper treatments, while yarrow treated bleeding and superficial wounds. Angelica archangelica, a tall, fragrant plant with hollow stalks and umbrella-shaped clusters of greenish-white blooms, was one of the most revered herbs in this sense. It flourished in Scandinavia's frigid conditions and was so prized that, long after the Viking Age was over, it was grown in monastery gardens. Because of its many therapeutic uses, Angelica was highly valued in early Northern European medicine. The root, leaves, and seeds were utilized by Viking healers to make a number of remedies. To combat interior illnesses, the root was most frequently dried and then steeped in decoction. It was used to promote circulation, purify the blood, and lessen inflammation, and was well known for its warming effects on the body. Angelica's antibacterial qualities were essential for healing infected wounds, particularly those that had been neglected or exposed to filth and deterioration. To treat festering wounds, a healer may crush the root and combine it with beeswax or animal fat to make a salve. When taken as a tea or tincture, Angelica helped treat fevers, stomach problems, and respiratory infections, diseases that could become fatal in the absence of antibiotics. However, Angelica's influence went beyond her ability to heal. Some plants were thought to possess divine vitality in Norse cosmology. Despite its Latin roots, the word Angelica itself reflects the plant's spiritual significance. It was believed to have been revealed by an angel to cure the plague in Christianized Europe. Despite having distinct spiritual systems, Vikings also believed that certain plants were divine gifts, given its potent aroma and striking form. Angelica was probably connected to protection and spiritual power. Angelica was utilized as a gynecological remedy by women who were frequently herbalists in the home. It was believed to control menstrual cycles and facilitate childbirth, which was a sacred and risky event in Norse culture. Angelica's reputation as a cleanser led to its usage in smoke rituals to purify homes and prevent illness during hospital stays. Angelica was an essential component of natural medicine in every Viking settlement, from isolated farms to coastal trading ports. It was a reliable friend in the healer's fight to protect life in a cruel and uncertain environment because of its efficacy and symbolic significance. Birch sap, one of the most important cures for fever and exhaustion, was delivered to the Viking culture with the arrival of spring. The birch tree, which is common throughout Scandinavia, served as a live pharmacy. In addition to being a supply of timber, in order to feed new leaves, the Vikings tapped the tree in the early spring and collected the sap, which was clear and slightly delicious, because the sap could only be collected for a little time before the tree fully awakened. This seasonal practice needed timing and ability. Birch sap was utilized by healers as a tonic for people who were weak from illness, prolonged winters, or persistent fevers. It was offered either fresh or fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage with a reputation for boosting vitality. Rich in natural sugars, minerals, and electrolytes, birch sap helped replenish lost energy and rehydrate the body, particularly after prolonged fasting or illness. Viking healers understood the healing potential of this natural gift in a time before professional nutrition science. Birch sap was frequently combined with infusions of cooling herbs like elderflower or meadow sweet to treat fevers. This mild mixture nourished the patient while lowering body temperature. In more extreme situations, the sap may be combined with bitter herbs, like as wormwood, to rid the body of humors thought to be detrimental. The reasoning was straightforward: purify, repair, and rebalance. The birch tree was used not only internally, but also externally. Boiling the bark created a tar-like material that has antibacterial qualities. It was applied to bites, mild burns, and skin diseases. In order to bring the physical and spiritual realms into harmony, birch leaves were also employed in steam baths and poultices to remove poisons from the body. These practices were frequently combined with rituals or prayer. The birch tree was symbolic of purity and rebirth. Because it was frequently the first tree to grow after land was burned or cleared, it was revered in both Germanic and Norse traditions for its capacity to regenerate. This concept was reflected in the use of its sap in medicine, which gave sick people new life and promised them recovery after adversity. Birch sap was a seasonal gem in the healer's profession, a clear, life-giving elixir that signified the year's change and the entrance of health in a harsh and frequently frigid region. Juniper was highly valued in Viking herbal medicine for its potent bodily and spiritual purified qualities. The prickly needles and fragrant berries of juniper bushes, which grew in abundance in the stony soils of Scandinavia, were among the most reliable instruments in a healer's toolbox. Juniper was used to purify the body, the air, and even the spirit, whether it was burned, boiled, or brewed. Historically, juniper berries were used to treat urinary tract infections and as a diuretic. They boosted kidney function when taken as a tea or decoction, assisting the body in eliminating excess water and toxic materials. Because of this, they were particularly helpful in cases of edema, bloating, or persistent fevers. In an era without antibiotics, the berries' mild antiseptic qualities also enabled them to treat illnesses from the inside out. Juniper smoke was essential for respiratory problems. In an attempt to ward off illness, healers would burn dried juniper branches and allow the smoke to permeate a tent or a chamber. This was not merely a symbolic act. The air was disinfected by the antibacterial chemicals found in juniper smoke. Viking dwellings and ships may be cleansed in this manner during sickness outbreaks or following a death. The practice, which excluded what could be seen and what could not, was both pragmatic and spiritual. Juniper branches were occasionally placed on the hot stones or added to the water in steam baths and sweat lodges, a custom common to many northern European tribes. The plant's pungent, energizing aroma filled the rising vapor, opening the lungs and causing profuse perspiration. It was believed that doing this would rid the body of pollutants and the soul of disharmony, restoring a person's connection to the natural cycles of health and nature. Ritual significance was also attached to juniper. Travelers may carry branches in little bundles for protection or hang them over entrances to fend off evil. Its powerful, earthy scent represented tenacity, and its use in healing served as a reminder that purification was about more than just bodily illnesses. It was also About invisible forces, juniper was more than just a cure for Viking healers. It was a plant of protection and rebirth, a protective barrier between the world's turbulent energies and the frail human body. One sip of tea or puff of smoke at a time, its strong berries and sharp needles kept sickness at bay. Meadowsweet, or Filipendula ulmaria, was one of the numerous herbs that Viking healers were familiar with, and it was prized for its capacity to reduce inflammation and alleviate pain. A mainstay of early Germanic and Norse herbal medicine, this aromatic shrub with creamy white blossoms was found in moist fields and along river banks. Despite lacking contemporary language, Viking healers understood that certain plants might lower fevers, ease pain, and promote a more gradual healing process. Headaches, joint discomfort, and stomach issues were frequently treated with meadowswet. A harsh climate where physical labor and exposure were commonplace. The flowers and leaves were dried and steeped to make teas that were administered to patients who had fevers or general discomfort. The herb's calming properties make it a vital treatment during sickness and convalescence. The Vikings were unaware that meadowsweet had substances that resembled salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin today. Its inherent capacity to relieve pain explains why it was so popular and successful. The effects were known, but the chemistry was unknown to healers. Less discomfort, less swelling, and a lower fever during the winter. When colds, joint pain, and respiratory infections were common, these advantages were especially crucial. Meadowsweet was thought to be a soothing remedy for heartburn, nausea, and stomach cramps. Its soothing qualities assisted in settling the stomach, and if available, it was occasionally mixed with other herbs, such as mint or chamomile, to provide a more comprehensive therapy. Because of its pleasant aroma, the plant was also a reassuring addition to healing practices, which frequently combined the therapeutic and the sensory. Meadowsweet had a function beyond only treating the body. It was linked to the natural cycles of life and death, development and decay. By its delicate, almost ethereal presence, its use may have involved symbolic actions like placing its blossoms next to the sick or incorporating it into funeral ceremonies to facilitate the transition to the afterlife, as is the case with many Viking medicines. Sweet-smelling herbs are described as gifts from the gods or spirits of the land in certain sagas and later folk legends. Meadowsweet was a silent but effective ally in a society that valued strength but recognized the need for healing. It aided in the recovery of youngsters, the rest of warriors, and the consolation of the elderly in their last years. It was among the healer's most dependable and gentlest instruments. In addition to being used as a medical herb, mugwort, or Artemisia vulgaris, was also used as a spiritual instrument by Viking healers. Mugwort was regarded as one of the most sacred plants in Germanic tradition, and it was well known throughout northern Europe for its bitter scent and silvery leaves. Mugwort acted as a link between the body, the intellect, and the invisible world in Viking societies, where healing was never merely physical. Mugwort was used medicinally to treat a variety of conditions. It relieved fatigue, irregular menstruation, and stomach issues. Its leaves were used to make a tea that helped with liver support, hunger stimulation, and stomach pains. Mugwort was especially used by Viking women to help with delivery and cycle regulation. Understanding these medicines was essential for the healer's survival throughout pregnancy and childbirth in a society without midwives or official obstetrics. Mugwort also soothed the nervous system because of its strong nerving qualities. It was believed that mugwort tea or smoke might safeguard the mind and restore inner equilibrium for warriors who suffered from insomnia or nightmares. Burning dried mugwort at the bedside or placing it under the pillow could help restore sleep, which was frequently disrupted following illness or conflict. This was more than just superstition. It is true that many fragrant plants have minor sedative properties. However, mugwort was closely associated with ritual and magic in addition to its medical applications. Mugwort was employed in ceremonies by Viking healers and wise women, known as valor or sidekunner. to evoke visions, protection, or dreams. In the Norse practice of trance magic and prophecy known as cedar, it was occasionally burned during ceremonies. It was thought that the rising smoke could fend off evil spirits or carry petitions to the gods. Mugwort may also be used by healers in times of emotional hardship, seasonal transitions, or solstice rites. Mugwort can be placed on the body during healing rituals, carried in a pouch for traveling, or hung over the door for protection. It was employed when the body or soul was in transition because of its potent vitality and harsh aroma, which made it a plant of thresholds. Mugwort meant more than just a herb to the Viking healer. It was a long-standing ally that stood at the nexus of magic and medicine, helping the ill to heal physically as well as spiritually by bringing them into harmony with the gods and the world. Garlic was one of the most useful and potent cures in the Viking healer's arsenal. Although it was not indigenous to Scandinavia, garlic had been traded throughout Europe for a long time and might have made its way to the Viking world through early contact with the British Isles, Frankish lands, and eastern marketplaces. Its powerful therapeutic properties and pungent aroma made it a vital component of early Norse medicine, particularly for parasites, infections, and disease prevention. Although not fully understood by science, garlic's antibacterial and antifungal qualities were widely recognized. Crushed garlic was used in poultices by Viking medics to cleanse wounds and stop them from festering. This was especially crucial for wounds from travel or combat. Garlic can relieve inflammation and kill harmful bacteria when applied directly to injuries. In an era when even little wounds may become fatal, this painful treatment was successful in preventing deeper infections. On the inside, garlic was frequently consumed raw, ground into paste, or steeped into potent infusions. It was thought to warm the body during sickness, cleanse the blood, and boost the immune system. Garlic was a useful tonic during the severe northern winters when colds, fevers, and coughs were common. It was occasionally mixed with honey, another antibacterial, to improve its therapeutic effects and make the potent flavor more tolerable. Additionally, intestinal worms, which were prevalent as a result of inadequate sanitation and frequent contact with cattle, were treated with garlic to cleanse the body. Little dosages of a vinegar and garlic mixture were given. In Norse healing traditions, its metaphorical weight came from its link with vigor and its potent cleansing properties. Garlic was thought to ward off bad spirits and evil powers outside the body. In addition to preventing disease, healers or household members may hang braided garlic near doorways or in sleeping quarters to defend against invisible threats, particularly during illness, childbirth, or war. It functioned as a spiritual defense as well as a medical cure. Garlic served as both a daily defense and a remedy for Viking warriors. Some people are thought to have eaten it in preparation for attacks or expeditions, seeing its fire and strength as a shield inside their bodies. Garlic thus represented perseverance, fending off infection, reviving the frail, and stabilizing the body in a perilous, dynamic world. The stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, was more than just an annoyance during the Viking Age. It was a power plant. In Norse medicinal traditions, nettle was considered one of the most valuable and esteemed herbs. Despite its excruciating sting, it was easily accessible to both households and healers due to its profuse growth in meadows, woodland margins, and close to settlements. It had many therapeutic uses, and its ability to withstand adversity reflected the Vikings' admiration for fortitude and tenacity. Nettle was mostly utilized to cure blood and vitality-related ailments. Nettle teas or broths were made by Viking healers to treat weakness, iron deficiency, and exhaustion. Nettle, which was high in iron, calcium, and vitamin C, served as a natural tonic and was particularly useful during the long winter months when food was limited and disease was easily spread. Nettle was frequently administered to youngsters recovering from fever or warriors recuperating from combat to help them regain their vitality. After being roasted or dried to lessen their sting, the leaves were brewed into infusions. These beverages were thought to encourage the body to get rid of toxic substances, improve circulation, and purify the blood. Nettle also has a mild diuretic effect, which made it helpful for treating joint pain and fluid retention, which are typical problems among older people and laborers. Nettle was occasionally employed in unexpected ways in external treatments. Urtication was a technique used to increase circulation and ease stiff muscles or arthritis by hitting aching limbs with fresh nettle stalks. It was thought to revitalize cold or rigid parts of the body, despite the pain. This approach was based on generations of observation and faith in the plant's energizing qualities, even though it was unconventional by today's standards. Beyond medicine, nettle had other useful use, particularly at periods when flax or wool were in short supply. Its fibers were utilized to manufacture textiles, fishing nets, and rope. Nettle's dual purpose of sustaining daily life and feeding the body made it an integral element of Viking culture. Nettle was a plant that represented tenacity. No matter how frequently it was trimmed back, it flourished in disturbed soil and came back year after year. Nettle was a symbol of the power and adaptability needed to survive in Norse society. It served as a reminder to the healer that even the most unpleasant plants might be therapeutic, and that sometimes the things that initially appeared to be detrimental can have great power. During the actual era, Viking herbal medicine was never documented in official documents. Rather, it existed in the spoken word, in chants that were passed down from mother to daughter, in the silent labor of healers who combined tradition, observation, and belief, and in the gestures that wise women exchange. These customs created a corpus of knowledge that was firmly anchored in Norse cosmology and the natural world. In the Viking civilization, treating illness meant more than just curing the body. It meant bringing the individual, the home, and the invisible threads that bound them to the gods back into harmony. Viking healers made use of the resources that the country offered. They knew how to conserve medicinal plants for the long winter months, which roots to dry in the fall, and which herbs to pick in the spring. Garlic, nettle, meadowsweet, mugwort, juniper, birch, yarrow, and angelica. Although each had a distinct role, they were all a part of a broader framework for comprehending the body in balance with nature. Yes, they were physical treatments, but they were also symbolic ones. Illness might be interpreted as an imbalance between the visible and invisible worlds, a challenge from the gods, or a disruption in fate. Women were essential in preserving and disseminating this knowledge. Families and communities were cared for by female healers in longhouses and farmsteads. Some assumed more specialized positions, such as the Vavlor, who were frequently called upon in times of crisis, and were seers, who combined prophecy with healing. Sacred plants, spiritual rites, and invocations of celestial beings, such as Frigg, air, or Freya, were frequently incorporated into their work. Healing was an act of connection between the mythological world and human existence, not merely a duty. Much of this oral heritage vanished, or was incorporated into new religious systems as Christianity and Norse paganism declined. Some of the plants and methods were taken up and maintained by monasteries, while others vanished or became enmeshed in superstition and terror. However, there are still remnants of Viking herbal therapy in contemporary herbalism, Scandinavian folk healing, and the resurgence of interest in traditional plant knowledge. The worldview that Viking healers kept is just as important as the plants they employed. Joan of Arc was born in the winter of 1412 in the remote village of Domremy, a sleepy hamlet in northeastern France, close to the Burgundian border. She believed that nature possesses power, that healing is both physical and spiritual, and that wisdom frequently rests in the hands of people who listen to the soil. Civil turmoil and conflict had shattered France at the time. Northern France was caught in the crossfire of the 100 Years' War, which had already raged between England and France for decades. The daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, pious peasants who brought up their kids in the Roman Catholic religion, Joan was born into this turmoil. Her family led a modest life. They lived off of farming, had a tiny plot of land and a few animals. Although Joan was not taught to read or write like the majority of the girls in her class, she was well known from a young age for her diligence and strong religious beliefs. She grew up mostly helping out around the house, taking care of the sheep, and going to church. She lived in a modest and deeply religious society. Someone who had already devoted hours to prayer and reflection might hear the voices she would later claim to hear. The region of Domremy itself was disputed. Although it was officially part of the French crown, it shared a border with the English-allied Burgundians. Violence was always a threat. Occasionally, Anglo-Burgundian forces would raid the area, damaging homes and crops. Joan would have been raised on tales of saints and warriors, of valor and triumph, of monarchs and despots. Her early years were marked by unpredictability, anxiety, and a need for tranquility. Despite the dread that pervaded France, Joan had a sense of belonging during her early years. Her neighbors characterized her as pious, kind, and unusually serious for her age, and she was well regarded in the village. She would subsequently assert that her heavenly mission started in a local chapel devoted to the Virgin Mary, where she frequently worshipped. The emotional and spiritual groundwork for the future was established throughout these years. The fields and churches of her village, rather than the royal court, were where she developed her religion, her devotion to the monarch, and her sense of purpose. Nobody could have predicted that this peasant girl, who was uneducated, unknown, and only a teenager, would one day stand in front of kings, command armies, and take on the power of empires. Joan of Arc's life was irrevocably altered when she was 13. She subsequently claimed that she had a vision in the summer of 1425, while she was by herself in her father's garden, accompanied by a voice that seemed as though it were from another world. She was scared at first. She recognized Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret as the figures that appeared alongside the voice, which was encircled by a brilliant light. In Catholic tradition, there are 3 strong saints. Over time, the clarity and intensity of these images would increase. The message was unambiguous yet remarkable. God selected her to aid in the rescue of France. Her supernatural mission was to expel the English from French land and to guarantee that Charles the Dauphin was crowned the legitimate king of France. For a young peasant girl who had no formal education, no military experience, and little social standing, it was a startling realization. At first, Joan didn't tell anyone, because she feared punishment or incredulity. She kept the visions to herself. However, the voices continued to urge her to take action. She grew more and more certain that her purpose was genuine during the ensuing years. She felt that her obedience and purity were necessary to carry out God's will, so she started to dedicate herself even more to prayer, fasting, and religious discipline. France's military and political circumstances had deteriorated by 1428. Much of northern France had fallen to the English, and Orleans, a crucial fortress, was besieged. Charles, the Dauphin, was still uncrowned, and his legitimacy was questioned. Now 16, Joan felt it was time to take action. She claimed to have a message for the king, so she traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and asked to speak with Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander. Baudricourt and his colleagues initially dismissed her with a laugh. The teenage girl was rarely believed when she claimed to have heavenly direction. Joan, however, persisted. She kept coming back, talking with a determination that impressed some and unnerved others. Baudricourt eventually gave in after learning of her reputation for piety, and that she had foreseen a military defeat in Orleans. Before the people had heard of it, he consented to send her to meet the Dauphin while wearing men's clothes and being escorted by armed guards. Through visions, faith, and an unwavering feeling of destiny, Joan had started her journey from a peasant child to a military emissary. Joan of Arc landed in Chinon, the court of Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, at the beginning of 1429. It had been a long and perilous voyage. In order to evade detection and attack, She disguised herself as a male and traveled over 300 kilometers through hostile territory. At last, she appeared before the royal court, where she was greeted with interest and suspicion. Uncertain of her intentions and suspicious of deceit, Charles chose to put her to the test. He started by hiding among his courtiers while dressed simply. Joan, who had never seen him before, recognized him right away and spoke to him straight. The witnesses were shocked that she allegedly revealed information to him about a private prayer or secret doubt that only he and his closest aides would have known. It was the first indication to many in the court that something unexplainable was going on. Charles was wary, though he had theologians and ecclesiastical officials at Poitiers study Joan. She was questioned for weeks regarding her theology, morals, and visions. Even though she was a teenage girl being interrogated by intelligent men, she responded calmly and confidently, since it was thought that her purity was necessary for her divine mission. Her virginity was put to the test. Despite her lack of formal education, the examiners praised her exceptional character and intelligence and found nothing unorthodox in her statements. The counselors to the palace decided that she might be transported with the troops to Orleans. However, Joan first asked for a symbolic item that would indicate that she was a divine ambassador in addition to being a soldier. She requested a banner. She was given a white banner with the words Jesus Maria and a figure of Christ stitched on it. She declared that she preferred the banner over the sword and carried it into every fight, making it her most prized possession. She also received a sword and a specially made white armor set, which she said she was guided by God to find under the altar of a St. Catherine de Fierbois chapel. Joan was ready to march toward Orleans with her armor, banner, and a company of troops. She was just 17 years old, inexperienced, and very certain that God had sent her to rescue France. One of the most illustrious military campaigns in European history would begin when she arrived at the besieged city. The English had been besieging Orleans for several months. By the spring of 1429, its destruction would have allowed access to the center of France and probably led to the breakdown of French resistance. Supplies were running low, morale was poor, and the Dauphin's cause was on the verge of defeat. Joan of Arc then showed up. On April 29th, she arrived in the city to roaring applause from those who thought she was a divine miracle. She swiftly rose to prominence, a representation of hope and divine favor. While riding a white horse and wearing white armor, her presence gave the French soldiers and civilians new life. Joan spoke boldly and authoritatively, encouraging swift action against the English defenses, despite her lack of professional military training. At first reluctant to obey a young peasant girl, French officers were eventually won over by her conviction. Joan argued that her voices had promised success and advocated an aggressive approach. She rode into battle with the soldiers despite her youth, frequently putting herself in the most hazardous situations. Others were motivated to battle with newfound vigor by her bravery on the field. The French launched a series of offensives to break the siege over the course of a week. Joan rallied the troops with chants of faith and determination while brandishing both her sword and her banner. She was injured when an arrow struck her shoulder during the attack on the castle of La Tourelle. After having the wound bandaged, she refused to back down and kept pushing the guys ahead. Returning to the field, the English eventually broke the siege and retreated on May 8th. It was a spectacular win that altered the course of the conflict. The English forces had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the French for the first time in years. There was no denying Joan's role. The tide had been turned by her spiritual power, boldness, and leadership. There was more to the Orleans victory than just military prowess. It marked a sea change in French national consciousness. The first portion of the divine mission had been accomplished by the peasant girl from Domremy. She now focused on her second objective, which was to witness the Dauphin's coronation as king at Reims, the customary location of French coronations. The process of gaining legitimacy had started. Once the siege of Orleans was over, Joan of Arc's focus moved to the crowning of Charles the Dauphin, a considerably more symbolic goal. This was more than just a political event in her visions. It was an order from God. At Rheims, the customary location for the anointing of French kings with sacred oil, Charles had to be crowned. However, Rheims was located deep within an area ruled by the English allies, the Burgundians. Joan and the French army would have to march through hostile territory to get there. Joan was determined despite the danger. She felt confident that God had made the way clear, and even the wary Charles started to be swayed by her conviction. Momentum was on their side following a string of triumphs in the Loire Valley. Notably, the conflicts at Jargeau, Monsieur-le-Roi, and Beaugency. As towns fell and morale rose, the army grew stronger. By July of 1429, Joan embarked on what would become known as the coronation journey with the royal court. Castles and cities opened their gates without opposition along the route. Word had gotten around about Joan's amazing achievement. Many thought that to oppose her was to oppose the will of God. There was an air of invincibility about her presence in the army, young, determined, and riding under her white banner. The French army arrived in Rheims on July 16th. The authorities of the city reluctantly gave up in peace. The following day, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France inside the Cathedral of Rheims. Joan held her banner high as she stood next to him. She saw it as the realization of the prophecy her voices had given her. The coronation was a triumphant occasion for Joan and for the next monarch. She had risen to lead armies and to crown a monarch's head from a small village. She was viewed by the populace as God's chosen messenger in addition to being a heroine. The war had changed from a political conflict to a spiritual cause because of her presence. However, stress accompanied triumph. Some in the court questioned Joan's continued power now that Charles was crowned. The focus shifted back to politics. Joan was not done, but she had done what she had been called to do. The next thing she wanted was to move forward and take back Paris. However, the backing she used to command so effortlessly was starting to falter. Following her coronation at Rheims, Joan of Arc advocated for a daring new goal. Paris was freed, although it was still governed by the English and the Burgundians. Regaining the French capital was more than simply a political goal for Joan. There was no political need for it. Her holy purpose included giving France back to its legitimate ruler. Her urgency was not shared by everyone, either. Newly anointed and politically wary, King Charles VII hesitated. His advisors advocated for a negotiated ceasefire with the Burgundians and advised diplomacy. But Joan didn't waver. She felt that God had already made the path for triumph obvious, and that waiting would only make the enemy stronger. Charles consented to an attack on Paris, but he wasn't quite committed. He weakened the effort before it started by delaying the campaign and providing insufficient troops. Early in September 1429, Joan came outside the city and readied herself for combat. With sturdy fortifications and skilled English and Burgundian soldiers inside, Paris was effectively protected. She oversaw an attack on the Porte Saint-Honor, one of the city's principal entrances. On September 8th, she continued to fight at the front lines while carrying her banner, inspiring the soldiers. With her prayers and unwavering will, the combat was intense. The defenders rained stones and arrows down. Despite being hit in the thigh by a crossbow bolt, Joan remained on the field. She called for another charge and kept leading the fight from behind the lines. However, the assault paused. Despite Joan's protests, Charles's commanders ordered a retreat as nightfall approached and the number of dead increased. An important turning point was the abortive invasion on Paris. Joan was still well liked by the regular soldiers and civilians, but concerns started to surface in court. She began to lose sway over royal policies. She was no longer as important to Charles, who was now king. Joan's previous victories started to be overshadowed by political interests, mistrust of her spiritual authority, and a fear of inciting more strife. Joan, however, was unfazed. In the months that followed, she led several small-scale campaigns and took towns like Saint-Pierre-le-Martyr and La Querite. frequently using gifts from supporters to fund her own activities. However, things were changing. Her idea of complete triumph ran counter to the king's growing prudence. Joan continued to believe that her job was not yet finished in spite of her wounds, her declining support, and her increasing political isolation. She refused to give up until France was free, but danger and treachery were looming in the background. Joan of Arc resumed her campaign in the spring of 1430, although her standing had become more vulnerable. Her military triumphs had not resulted in long-term political influence. King Charles VII, who was now more interested in diplomacy than war, provided only ambivalent backing. Joan focused on the town of Compiègne, which was in danger from Burgundian armies, mainly on her own initiative. She came in May 1430 with the intention of mobilizing the populace and defending the city. However, she was up against the odds. The English allies, the Burgundians, were advancing in greater numbers. Joan led a small force in a sortie to confront the besiegers and break their lines on May 23. French forces were driven back while the battle took place outside the city walls. Determined to keep her soldiers safe, Joan stayed behind to cover the retreat. The city gates closed too soon in the confusion. Joan was stuck outside with a couple of friends. She battled until she was dragged off her horse and captured by Burgundian cavalry. The blow of her capture was severe. Not just for Joan, but also for the French people's spirits. The girl who had crowned a king and lifted the siege of Orleans was now a prisoner. For months, Joan was detained by the Burgundians, who treated her less like a normal prisoner and more like a political prize. Her final sale to the English for a substantial price solidified her reputation, a danger to their cause. She was seen by the English as a dangerous symbol of resistance and divine legitimacy in addition to being a military foe. Joan made multiple attempts to flee during her captivity. She once suffered severe injuries when she leapt from a tall structure, but she lived. Her will was unwavering even in chains. Instead of being viewed as a criminal or heretic, she insisted on being treated as a heroic prisoner of war. The English, however, had other ideas. They didn't want to keep her around forever. They intended to ruin her reputation, her integrity, and the authority she had come to stand for. They were already preparing her trial. Joan's last and most terrifying chapter began with her capture at Compiègne. After rising from poverty to the pinnacles of power, she was deceived, left behind, and turned over to her adversaries. Her tale was far from over, though. Joan of Arc was taken into English hands and taken to Rouen, the English administrative center in occupied Normandy, following months of being held by the Burgundians. She was put through a proper ecclesiastical trial there starting in January 1431. But this time she was tried as a heretic rather than a prisoner of war, which gave her captors the right to deprive her of her honor and have her put to death in accordance with church law. Bishop Pierre Cochon, a fervent opponent of Joan and supporter of the Burgundian cause, convened a panel of pro-English French clergy that conducted the trial, which was planned by the English. Its real objective was to destroy Joan's legacy, not to bring about justice. The English aimed to discredit Charles VII, whose crowning she had made possible, by calling her a heretic. In clear breach of church law, Joan was detained in a secular prison under the watchful eye of male soldiers. She was regularly questioned, frequently for hours at a time, without assistance or arrest, refused access to legal representation, and threatened with torture. She was a 19-year-old peasant girl, but she defended herself with astonishing intelligence and poise against some of France's most educated men. She was questioned for several months about her role in the conflict, her faith, her clothes, and her visions, her claim to divine voices, and her practice of dressing in men's clothing, which the Church deemed to be both heretical and abnormal, were the judge's main points of interest. Joan refused to back down from her testimony, in spite of their pressure. She insisted that she had always been obedient to the Church, that her voices were from God, and that she had followed heavenly instructions. She once famously said, "If I am not, may God place me there, in response to a question about whether she thought she was in God's grace. "May God keep me there if I am." Even her interrogators were struck by her strong response, which was neither haughty nor self-deprecating. However, the result was never really in doubt. Truth was subordinated to political need because of her insistence on wearing masculine clothing, which she had resumed in prison for protection, and her refusal to repudiate her visions. Joan was ultimately found guilty of heresy. She received a death sentence. A court of men determined to obliterate her from history would now silence the girl who had once raised a nation not through military defeat, or so they believed. Joan of Arc was taken to the Rouen marketplace early on May 30, 1431, when she was chained to a wooden stick and set ablaze. She was only 19. She allegedly constantly cried out the name of Jesus and requested that a cross be held in front of her eyes as the flames erupted around her. Inspired by her bravery, a soldier gave her a little wooden cross. According to witnesses, she approached death with composure. The purpose of her execution was to silence a dangerous symbol, serve as a final warning, and be final. However, the reverse resulted. Joan became a martyr rather than being forgotten. The sight unsettled even Burgundian and English spectators. Some people cried, others publicly questioned whether the church had done something seriously wrong. It was reported that one of the English clerics there cried out, "We are lost. A saint has been burned." Joan's reputation only got stronger in the years that followed. A strong legend was built around her unshakable faith, bravery in combat, and dignified defense during her trial, after a thorough investigation undertaken by Pope Calixtus III. Joan's trial was ruled unlawful in 1456, 25 years after her death. Officially, she was found not guilty. Heresy was removed from her name. Over the ensuing years, Joan of Arc emerged as a symbol of French unification. Her narrative was recalled as a beacon of bravery, patriotism, and divine mission during times of national difficulty, especially during the French Wars of Religion and later during the Franco-Prussian War. Her life was immortalized by writers, artists, and historians. Her visage was featured in literature, sculpture, and stained glass. She was hailed as a humble peasant and a national hero, a warrior and a mystic. Joan of Arc was officially declared a saint by the Catholic Church in 1920, some 500 years after her execution. Now, one of the most admired figures in the church was the girl who had been condemned by its authorities. On May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom, people celebrate her feast day. Joan of Arc is still regarded as one of the most famous people in history. Every expectation was defied by her life: saint, warrior, peasant, prophet, and prisoner. She changed the direction of a kingdom with her conviction and faith. She entered folklore through fire. She also endures in memory. A medieval baker's life started out in the dark. Bakers were working long before church bells tolled or roosters cranked. Usually, their day began at midnight, when the majority of the population was sound sleeping. The streets were motionless and cold, but inside the bakehouse, the kneading rhythm started. The flour dust hung in the air, and fires blazed. Bread in the Middle Ages wasn't made randomly. It needed a practiced hand and exact timing. In order to give the loaves their rise and flavor, bakers used sourdough starters, which are carefully tended fermenting dough. No commercial yeasts were present. Everything was done through experience, smell, and touch. The flour was often coarse, milled in a nearby mill, and had a distinct personality depending on the area, time of year, and grain quality. To stretch their supply of flour, some bakers even combined bran, barley, or beans. They drew water from public fountains or wells. Hand measurements and mixing were required for everything, frequently in the faint light of candles or oil lamps. The dough needed to be kneaded until it achieved the proper texture, which required strength and repetition, and the mixing basin was typically made of wood. For the dough to properly rise during the colder months, it needed to be kept warm with cloths or close to the hearth. Long before baking, The oven, typically a big brick building with a dome, had to be heated until the walls generated enough heat to bake multiple loaves of bread. Bakers would burn bundles of wood inside before sliding the loaves in the oven. Floor was wiped off with a moist towel or a wooden peel, and the ashes were carefully scraped out. The bakers had already taken their first bread from the oven as the town awoke, with merchants erecting their stalls and church doors opening for morning mass. The air was heavy with the aroma of warm bread. It was the aroma of daily survival and nutrition. Bread was the main component of every meal for many people in the medieval era, but it was only the beginning for the baker. It was necessary to serve customers, make deliveries, and maintain records. There wasn't much time for relaxation once the ovens had cooled and the counters had been cleared, since the dough for tomorrow needed to be mixed before the moon set once more. The baker's job in medieval communities never really finished. A baker required more than simply wheat and fire to become proficient in the everyday rigors of medieval baking. They used a reliable set of instruments that had been honed over many centuries of use. Although the bakehouse itself was frequently a straightforward building made of stone or wood, inside it was a specialized world. Every object had a function, and effectiveness may spell the difference between reward and penalty. The oven was the center of any bakery. These were huge, dome-shaped structures that were usually made of clay or brick and were intended to hold heat for hours. The oven took a while to heat up. Inside, bundles of wood, typically beech or oak, were burned until the walls radiated the perfect warmth. After that, the bread was loaded using a peel, and the ashes were swept out. Bakers were able to slip loaves deep into the heated chamber without getting burned thanks to a wooden paddle with a long handle. Another necessary component was the kneading trough, which was either constructed from hefty planks or carved from a single block of wood. Because these troughs were low and wide, bakers could lean into their work. Larger bakeries occasionally had multiple troughs operating simultaneously to meet demand, and the dough was mixed and processed by hand. Although crude, measuring instruments were essential. Although the consistency varied, the majority of bakers employed wooden scoops or hand-carved measures for salt and flour. There were few scales, and municipal officials or local guilds frequently enforced accuracy. Underweighting loaves to defraud clients could result in severe fines or worse. Water was transported in buckets from wells or streams, and flour was kept in wooden barrels or cloth bags. Particularly in more affluent locations were affluent, customers demanded finer bread. Some bakeries also had sieves to remove husks or detritus. However, the poorer classes typically used coarser flours. The baker's calloused, seasoned, and years of repetition trained hands were maybe the most valuable instrument. They could tell when a loaf was just starting to sing its last crusty notes, when the dough was ready, and when the oven was hot enough. Before the following day, everything needed to be cleaned and ready. Despite their seeming simplicity, the instruments were a part of a greater rhythm, a cycle of work, skill, and heat that turned grain into bread that could feed life. Every tool in the hands of a medieval baker contributed to the sustenance of a town. Bread served as more than just nourishment in the Middle Ages. It served as the basis for all meals and served as a social class indicator. Not all bread was made equal, but almost everyone consumed it on a daily basis. Your diet revealed a lot about your personality. The finest bread, referred to as manquette or white bread, was requested by the wealthiest residents, aristocrats, clergy, and successful businessmen. This fluffy, pale, and pricey bread was made from carefully sifted wheat flour. Its production involved additional work, grinding, bran filtering, and employing only the finest grain components. It became extremely expensive because of this labor-intensive process, making it unaffordable for the average person. Wheaten or ravel bread was the norm for both tradespeople and townspeople. Although it was still produced from wheat, it was more nutrient-dense, slightly darker, and less refined. Bakers sold it in larger quantities than manquette because it achieved a balance between price and quality. To stop bakers from taking advantage of the needy, laws in some places required that this bread be sold at a set weight and price. However, maslin, or black bread, was available to the impoverished, laborers, peasants, and beggars. It was typically baked from a combination of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else was on hand. This bread was gritty, dense, and occasionally bitter. Bakers may even expand it with chestnut flour, beans, or peas during difficult times. Yes, it was gratifying, but it also served as a reminder of one's social position. Bread in monasteries differed according to the order. While larger institutions prepared superior white bread for visitors and senior clergy, other monks consumed basic loaves in accordance with their vows of poverty. Bread served as a social tool as well. Rich nobles used trenchers, which are thick slices of stale bread, as dishes during feasts. These were either distributed to the underprivileged or consumed by servants after the meal. Bread was frequently distributed as charity at monastery gates or from aristocratic kitchens. These distinctions had to make sense to a good baker. They baked more than one kind of loaf. To satisfy the demands of the whole town, they created several types every day. Bread was more than simply food. It was ingrained in every crust and included hierarchy, economy, and identity. Bread determined who had more and who survived on less in a society where the majority of people lived on less. In medieval Europe, baking was more than just a skill. It was a legal issue as well, because bread was seen as so vital to life. Local governments and trade guilds strictly regulated its manufacturing. For a baker, breaking the rules meant more than just losing revenue. It might entail incarceration, loss of employment, or public disgrace. Guilds governed the profession in the majority of towns and cities. These were groups of artisans who controlled supply, pricing, training, and quality. Strict guidelines for bread's weight, dimensions, and ingredients were set by bakers' guilds. These requirements were mandatory. Strict sanctions and frequent inspections were used to enforce them before being permitted to run their own ovens. New bakers frequently had to complete a number of years of apprenticeship. Being a member of a guild offered protection as well as privilege. It provided a certain level of economic stability and allowed bakers to sell in the town market. However, it also obligated them to an accountability framework. Guild officials have the authority to fine, suspend, or even remove a baker's baking privileges if they are found to be selling underweight loaves or using subpar ingredients. In addition to the guilds, local officials kept an eye on the quality of the bread. For example, in England, a regulation from the 13th century called the assize of bread and ale specified how much bread a customer should get for a certain amount that changed according to the price of grain. Officials referred to as ale tasters or bread weighers recorded infractions and carried out surprise inspections. Breaking bread laws could result in severe punishment. Some bakers were derided, imprisoned in public stocks, and pelted with bad food and stale bread. Others were made to march through the town wearing mediocre loaves around their necks. A repeat offender may, in severe circumstances, be expelled from the town or prohibited from engaging in the trade. These guidelines were necessary for survival, not merely for justice. In periods of inflation or famine, bread riots posed a serious risk. Town officials were aware that unrest would ensue if residents believed they were being defrauded of their daily bread. In those days, being precise was not only a source of pride for medieval bakers, but it was also required by law, because baking was viewed as a public service and not merely a trade by the municipality and the guild. Every loaf had to be up to par. Not only was operating a medieval bakery difficult, but it was also risky. Fire was a continual hazard as well as a need. In order to bake dense loaves, ovens needed to reach extremely high temperatures, and sustaining that heat required burning a lot of wood, frequently in enclosed rooms composed of stone, thatch, or lumber that had been blackened by years of smoke. The majority of bake houses were built with a sizable clay or brick domed oven facing an outer wall to facilitate loading and ventilation. Bakers used a roaring fire inside the oven to heat it. This was no ordinary campfire. Rather, it was a fierce fire designed to superheat substantial walls and provide hours of warmth. After raking out the embers and cleaning the hearth with a moist cloth or brush soaked in sand, bakers would start baking. However, a single instant of negligence could result in disaster. Thatched roofs may catch fire, embers could escape, and a bakehouse fire could spread horribly quickly in crowded towns and cities. Because of this, a lot of communities mandated that bakeries be on the outskirts or, if the baker could afford it, be constructed using certain fire-resistant materials. Bakers also had to deal with health hazards. Long-term exposure to smoke and heat damaged the skin and lungs. Over time, the body was worn down by the heavy lifting of flour sacks and the kneading of large batches of dough. When loading and unloading hot loaves with long wooden peels, burns to the arms, hands, and faces were common. Public bakeries existed in several cities, particularly in less affluent areas. A professional baker would oversee a central oven where families would bring their own dough. Although this approach decreased private home fire hazards and conserved fuel, it also came with risks. Loaves may be stolen, burned, or altered. Bakers were held accountable for the quality of the bread produced in each home, and any carelessness could result in official complaints. Because bread was such an essential staple, the entire community may be affected if a bakehouse was disturbed by a fire, illness, or accident. The baker wasn't the only one who suffered. The loss affected the entire community. The bakehouse continued to be the center of daily life in spite of these risks. With each blazing loaf, risk and reward burned side by side in this realm of labor, heat, and essential ritual. Although male apprentices and guild members are frequently portrayed as medieval bakers, women were crucial to the daily manufacturing of bread, but frequently disregarded. Women were the main breadwinners for the family and the community in many towns and villages, particularly those that were not part of large cities. To keep the ovens hot and the populace supplied, they had to be present in the bakehouse. Women were usually in charge of baking in the home in rural settings. They used little hearths or communal ovens to bake for their families, and when they had enough, they may sell loaves at the market or right outside their house. This bread-related side business provided many women with an uncommon source of self-sufficiency. In urban areas as well, widows of bakers were frequently allowed to carry on their husbands' businesses, occasionally succeeding as independent bakery proprietors. Although they weren't totally exclusive, guilds were typically dominated by men. Female bakers were officially recognized in several areas, particularly in France and Germany. Women could manage bakeries, train apprentices, including daughters or nieces, and inherit licenses. Some even successfully petitioned for and were granted full guild rights, despite the legal and social obstacles they had to overcome. In bakehouses, women carried out the same arduous tasks as men, preparing dough in enormous troughs, transporting flour and water, controlling oven temperatures, and selling bread in marketplaces. Many also sold bread, ambulating the streets with carts full of loaves or baskets placed on their heads, managing daily sales and interacting directly with customers. These women were frequently the bakery's public face. In spite of their efforts, women were frequently paid less and given less credit than males. They were subject to severe penalties for violations and were more likely to be accused of selling underweight or subpar loaves. Nevertheless, their role was crucial, particularly in times of war or plague when communities depended on women to maintain the food supply and males were not there. Baking also had connections to caregiving and parenthood. A lady with good baking skills was respected and viewed as capable of providing for her family, upholding customs, and imparting information. Recipes and baking methods were passed down, as heirlooms from mother to daughter in many families. Women used bread to influence medieval civilization everywhere, from hamlet ovens to aristocratic kitchens. Their hands were among the first to touch the dough that would feed entire villages. Yet history frequently did not give them names. Bread was more than just nourishment in medieval Europe. It was considered sacrosanct. Few organizations had a greater impact on bread production than the church, which not only devoured enormous amounts of bread but also dictated its distribution, regulation, and symbolism. Bread was a representation of life, sacrifice, and the presence of God in monasteries, cathedrals, and hamlet chapels. The Eucharist, the Christian ritual in which bread became the body of Christ, was central to this relationship. This bread, also known as the host, had to be prepared according to precise rules. It had to be unleavened, and only the best white wheat flour could be used. This sacred task was given to particular monks in monasteries, who baked in special ovens in silence, frequently at night. These wafers were treated with the utmost respect and stamped with holy insignia. However, the Church's connection to bread extended well beyond custom. In medieval Europe, monasteries were among the biggest producers of food and land. Numerous individuals operated their own bakeries, generating enormous quantities of bread for the monks, their employees, and visitors. Several portions of bread were usually served with cheese, ale, or pottage as part of the daily monastic diet. Monasteries were also lifelines for the impoverished, giving alms bread to travelers and beggars who waited at the gates. Bread was regularly donated to cathedrals and parish churches by affluent patrons and local bakers. These offerings could be utilized in ceremonial processions, given to the poor, or displayed on feast days. In remembrance of the deceased. Loaves were blessed and distributed at unique bread shrines in several communities. The church had a regulating function as well. Some communities, particularly those with a local clergy-controlled business activity, used ecclesiastical courts to settle conflicts between bakers and patrons. They assisted in enforcing fair weights and prices, frequently driven by the conviction that defrauding bread buyers was not only immoral but also wicked. Special breads, such as rich, spice loaves fashioned into crosses, doves, or other holy shapes, were cooked for religious feast days. The liturgical year's rhythm was marked by these celebration breads, which were frequently shared in the community. To deepen ties of friendship and faith, bread served as both physical and spiritual sustenance in the medieval imagination. Providing bread to the church meant more to the baker than just making money. It meant taking part in the sacred economy of existence, where routine was as much a part of the oven's reverberation as ceremony, and dough became heavenly. Power and food were closely related in the medieval world. Controlling the cost, availability, and quality of bread was just as crucial to rulers, mayors, guild masters, and monarchs as upholding law and order. The availability of bread was closely related to political stability, since it was the primary food for the majority of people, frequently accounting for 70% or more of a person's diet. Price limits were the most obvious manifestation of this. By enacting laws such as the assize of bread and ale in England, which linked the price of a loaf to the price of grain at the time, cities and kingdoms set official rates for bread. Bakers were supposed to change the size of their loaves, not the price. If grain costs increased as a result of war, drought, or bad harvests, because of this, bakers were forced to make smaller loaves at the same price during periods of scarcity, which frequently reduced their personal earnings. However, a baker might face severe penalties if they were found to have defrauded clients or sold loaves that were lighter than the authorized weight. Cheating was viewed by authorities as a betrayal of public confidence in addition to theft. Bakers were vilified in certain places and made to stand in public stocks with underweight bread. Others faced penalties, embarrassment, or even a baking ban. Additionally, bakers had to maintain thorough records of their flour consumption, grain purchases, and loaves made. unannounced inspectors could arrive to check ovens and weigh loaves. To guarantee equitable distribution, bakers were occasionally kept under military protection during extremely sensitive periods, such as during war or famine. One of the most dreaded manifestations of unrest was bread riots. Mobs might swiftly emerge when bread became expensive or scarce. Bakers may be accused of favoring the wealthy or hoarding flour in such situations. Records could be destroyed and entire stores plundered. City officials would occasionally confiscate grain supplies or subsidize bread in order to keep the peace and avoid protests and famine. Bread's importance in life led to its use as a tool for both control and compassion. In order to gain favor with the populace, rulers distributed bread during religious holidays or public celebrations. Loyalty was strengthened in castles where lords made sure their followers and staff had enough provisions. Additionally, a consistent supply of reasonably priced bread was regarded as a sign of sound government in communities. Bread was more than just nourishment in medieval politics. It was a symbol of power. And the baker was standing where authority and hunger met. The medieval baker left a legacy that influenced the basic basis of daily life, despite the fact that they are rarely mentioned in chronicles or extolled in hymns. People were nourished by the humble baker amid a world full of monarchs, knights, castles, and cathedrals. Even though they worked in the dark, the influence they had on every home was felt before the town woke up. Beyond the ovens, the baker had an impact on medieval society's cultural fabric. Bread was consumed at every stage of life, from conception to death. It was offered in grief, shared at weddings, honored at church altars, and present at baptisms. Centuries of survival, tradition, and belief were embodied in each bread that was prepared. The baker's abilities were handed down through the centuries, frequently through apprenticeships or families. Repetition and manual instruction were used to teach techniques: how to stretch flour during lean times without compromising quality, how to sense when dough was done, and how to check the oven's temperature without a thermometer. These customs have strong local and communal roots. While a baker in one area could choose rye and oats, another would use imported wheat or barley. Each community had its own distinct flavor. The function of the baker changed over time as towns and trade flourished. Commercial bakeries proliferated by the late Middle Ages, when baking started to evolve from a tiny home hobby to a thriving business. Better road infrastructure made it easier for grain to travel from farms to markets, and innovations like windmills and water mills increased the production of flour. The fundamental rhythm of baking stayed the same in spite of this advancement: get up, knead, form, heat, and nourish. The medieval baker was the silent steward of a cycle as old as civilization. Echoes of their work can still be heard today. Companies, which means with bread, is the Latin root of the word companion in many languages, a reminder that life was shared when bread was shared. The common ovens of medieval communities established the basis for today's neighborhood bakeries, while the guilds that formerly governed bakers cleared the path for contemporary food safety regulations. Ultimately, the lasting existence of a community is what the medieval bakers left behind. Not just the breads they produced, they fed more than just bodies with bread, fire, and faith. Whole cultures were sustained by them.